Good afternoon to the East Coast and good morning to the West Coast. My name is Katie Rowley. I'm with the NOAA Central Library, and we are very excited to offer you this new series for the National Stock Assessment. It's going to be called the National Stock Assessment Science Seminars. And a few housekeeping things before we get started. If you are having any audio or visual issues with your with GoToWebinar, please log out and try logging back in. That fixes most issues. If you still have problems, please send me a chat or email library.brownbag@noaa.gov and I will try and help you out. We will be accepting questions, but we're holding all questions until the end of the presentation. So please ask them at any point, but know that they will be answered after the presentation has wrapped. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Kristen Blackheart, who will introduce our speaker.
Thanks, Katie. Good morning, good afternoon to everybody, depending on where you are. Thanks for joining us today. As Katie said, this is a new monthly seminar series that we're beginning to discuss the technical aspects of stock assessment science, with the goal to increase communication between our regional stock assessment scientists, enhance discussion of stock assessment methodologies, and improve the visibility of NOAA fisheries assessment science. I'm pleased today to introduce our very first seminar speaker in the series, Dr. Michelle Sculley from the Pacific Islands Fisheries Science Center in Honolulu, Hawaii. Michelle will be discussing a collaborative project exploring the use of environmental covariates in the assessment of North Pacific swordfish. So with that, I'm happy to hand it over to Michelle.
Thanks, Kristen. Thanks everyone for coming today. I'm happy to be the first person to go as I can set the precedent for our seminar series. So as Kristen mentioned, I'm a stock assessment scientist at the Pacific Islands Fisheries Science Center. I primarily work on our pelagic highly migratory species. And so I work with a great group of international scientists to really forward the science for swordfish and striped marlin and blue marlin. And so today I'm going to focus on some work that we've been doing with our North Pacific swordfish assessment. Before I start, I just want to acknowledge all of the people that have contributed to this this work. So first, my collaborators for this project have been Hirotaka Ejima out of Japan, and then Phoebe Woodworth-Jeffcoats, who's an oceanographer here at the Pacific Islands. And then, as all of you know, a stock assessment is not the work of a single person. And so the ISC Billfish Working Group, the folks that worked on the swordfish assessment, which is John Brodziak, Annie Yao, EJ Chang, Jen Su, and Minoru Kanaiwa. And then also several people that have contributed to giving us data or information and trying to better understand the climate and oceanography modeling side. So that Charlie Stock and his team out of the Geophysical Fluids Dynamics Lab in Princeton, and then John Nath and his team out of the National Environmental Satellite Data and Information Service. So really, this is a collaboration across NOAA line offices and international scientists. So it's the work of a lot of people, and I'm very pleased to be able to talk about it today. I also want to say that it is still a work in progress. So I really hope at the end of the seminar, people who have suggestions for their work and other things that we may think about and work on, I'm very open to any comments people have. I'd love to hear from you. So with that, many of you are probably familiar with this figure. It comes out of the 2018 Stock Assessment Improvement Plan, which I'm sure all stock assessment scientists at NOAA have read. But one of the things that I want to highlight is that in looking at the next generation of stock assessments, one of the things that people continue to look at and point to as important is the idea of ecosystem-based fisheries management. And with that comes the incorporation of climate, habitat, and oceanography into our assessment. And that's because these three things affect not only the population dynamics of the fishery, but also the behavior of our fishermen. And so in recognizing this, we have been looking at how can we approach incorporating climate and oceanography into our pelagic assessments. I don't know if you guys can still hear me, but my PowerPoint just froze, so give me 1 second to see if it will turn back on.
We can still hear you, Michelle.
Okay. Technology, right? Let's see. Here we go. Okay, thanks. Sorry about that. So one of the things that we recognize in working with pelagic species, especially in the Pacific, is that it can be very challenging. Swordfish are a highly migratory species. They move long distances over short periods of time. The figure on your right is some tagging data from Melanie Abacas's paper looking at satellite tagged swordfish tagged out of the Southwest Center in California. And you can see they've moved all over the Eastern Pacific out to Hawaii. One swordfish has been reported to travel, over 2,600 kilometers in only 62 days. They can move 25 kilometers a day. So understanding why fish are where they are when it's pelagic is challenging, because we don't know when we see them if they're moving through the area, if they're staying in the area. The Pacific in general is very large. It's the largest body of water on the planet. It's hard to collect data. We have good data that we can pull from modeling, and we also have remote sensing data, but fish don't live at the surface, so there's only so much that we can infer about a fish's behavior or fish's preference for where they're living based on remote sensing data. And so one of the things that we look into is using climatological indices as a proxy, as they generally indicate a specific set of environmental conditions. For example, during a La Nina, the Eastern Tropical Pacific is cooler than average, and that drives an entire global change in the environment and in the water. And so using climatological indices, we kind of get at the environment as a whole and less as a specific environmental parameter. And then finally, just tagging is expensive. It's hard to put enough tags on enough fish in enough areas to really get an idea of what our migratory species are doing. And so we face some challenges that we wouldn't otherwise when we're talking about understanding the environment that a pelagic highly migratory species might encounter. So today I'm going to talk about the work that we're doing to incorporate climate environment into our swordfish assessment. So I'm going to kind of divide the talk into three components. First, I'll just give you guys some background on what our base case model is. And then we'll talk about how we're incorporating the environmental data into the assessment. And then also we're looking into projecting this assessment into the future with some projected environmental covariates in it. So a little bit of background. In 2018, the ISC assessed the Western and Central North Pacific stock of swordfish, sorry. And the way that we have divided our stock is this purple line here divides North Pacific stock into the Western Central North Pacific stock and then the Eastern Pacific Ocean stock. And so our assessment covers the majority of the North Pacific. It covers all of the fish caught by U.S. fisheries in the Pacific for swordfish. And it is, to the best of our knowledge, a self-contained stock. There's always uncertainty. We have tagging data that show that, you know, swordfish do cross this boundary, but we have tagging data that shows swordfish move all over the Pacific. So we divide the stock as best as possible. This is based on work by John Braziak and Dr. Ikinawa for looking at patterns in CPUE. So there's 4 primary fleets that catch swordfish in the North Pacific: Japan, Hawaii, Taiwan, and South Korea. And these are all longline fisheries. And these target swordfish specifically. So swordfish are targeted on generally shallow set long lines set at night, often with light sticks. And you can see based on the distribution of their catches, they tend to be spatially separated between all of these 4 different fleets. And Japan, the US, Hawaii, and Taiwan are the 3 fleets that we have participation in the stock assessment and also provide indices of abundance. So we can get an idea of the swordfish stock throughout the entire area based on the distribution of catches of all 4 of these fleets. So swordfish are sexually dimorphic, and so the female swordfish grow to larger sizes than male swordfish, especially after 3 to 4 years is when they really start to diverge. Female swordfish also mature later than male swordfish. So on the right is the maturity schedule for swordfish. The blue is male and this gray is female. And I've highlighted the 50% maturity point. And so for males, they mature at about 1 year is when they can start reproducing. Females, it's not until they're between 3 and 4 years. And we believe that swordfish in the North Pacific spawn around the Hawaiian archipelago between April and July, based on larval fish studies around Hawaii. And so we have some pretty good information, more than some other species, about, you know, when swordfish are spawning, where they're spawning. And so from this, we can pull some information about recruitment out of our information. So our stock assessment is a 2-gender model to reflect the fact that females and males grow at different schedules and also mature at different schedules. These are the length composition data that are available for the base case model. 4 of them were included in the final model. So we have Japan longline data. We have Japan, their coastal drift net data, which is from 1994 on. We have the Hawaii longline data, which is starts in 1994 to the present, and then also the IATTC data, which is an aggregate of all of the IATTC catches that are within the Western Central North Pacific stock area. These other length composition data were excluded from the model because of conflicts within the data, but I do want to highlight the Hawaii deep set data. And so the deep set fishery in the Hawaiian longline target tuna, but as you can see, they catch very small swordfish, and this will become important when we start looking at our relative indices of relative abundance. So we have 8 indices of relative abundance in this assessment model, several from the Japan longline, and then 3 from the US and 1 from Taiwan. So the 3 from the US are 2 from the swordfish targeting shallow set data, and then the deep set long line data, which I mentioned targets small swordfish. And so these swordfish are young in the year, and so we actually use this as an index of recruitment in our model rather than an index of relative abundance. Catches of swordfish have been decreasing since 1975, with a slight peak in the 1980s, but overall interest in targeting of swordfish has declined over time. So Japan catches the majority of the swordfish. The U.S. has been decreasing their catches as management restrictions have gone into place. And Taiwan has actually been increasing the proportion of their catch of swordfish. But overall, swordfish catches are declining. So the basics of the assessment model is it's run in stock synthesis version 3.30. It covers 1975 to 2016, and we have length composition data from 1994 to 2016. It's a quarterly time step with 2 genders, and the base model shows, met all the convergence criteria. The diagnostics showed no areas of concern. There's no conflict within the data, and in 2018, it was accepted as scientific information available by the Western and Central Pacific Fisheries Commission for providing management advice. So the base model, it's the first stock synthesis model, the first age-structured model that was used for North Pacific swordfish to provide management advice. The working group has been working to get an age-structured model up and running for swordfish, and we've finally gotten a first round iteration of one. There's certainly work still to be done. We still have length composition data that we haven't managed to fit into the model. Our deep set data, which has all of the small fish, will be really useful for providing information on recruitment. But that's more work to be done, and certainly something we plan on tackling as we move forward with this assessment model. But as a first run, we're very pleased with how it turned out. Now, the results of this assessment indicated that the stock has never been fished below biomass, spawning stock biomass at MSY. So on the left is the biomass, female spawning biomass over time. The green line indicates at the MSY level. And so you can see after a decline into the 1990s, the stock has been increasing ever since. And this is consistent with the decrease in catches and the overall decrease in interest in catching swordfish. Similarly, fish mortality has been below MSY for almost all years except 1 year. And fishing mortality has been decreasing, and it's currently half of fishing mortality at MSY, and so it's at about 0.8 right now. And finally, the last important thing that I want to point out about this assessment is that based on the current Beverton Holt stock recruitment, the stock is on the flat side of the curve. So swordfish have a steepness of 0.9, I think, of around 0.9. So they're known to recover quickly, but because the stock is in good shape, we're pretty far up here on the flat part of the curve. So a change in spawning biomass doesn't change recruitment, wouldn't change predicted recruitment much. So now we've covered the base case model. I'm going to talk about some of the work that we've been doing to incorporate the environmental data into our assessment model. So the key question here is, why are we focused on swordfish recruitment? And there's many things that could be, driving changes in population dynamics, but we have good information on swordfish recruitment. We have a good idea of where they're spawning. We have a good idea of when they're spawning. And we have evidence of periodic strong year classes in our length composition data. And so all of these lend credence to the idea that if there is some kind of environmental influence on recruitment, that we could identify, then swordfish would be one we could identify it for. And so what you can see here is that this is the residuals from the estimated size at age for, I'm sorry, numbers at size, yes, for swordfish out of the stock synthesis model. And I've highlighted here in the Japan longline fleet that we periodically see this influx of positive residuals. And the dark colors indicate positive residuals. The white is negative residuals, which means so when we see large dark circles, we have more fish of that size at that time than expected based on population dynamics and selectivity. And so what you can see I've highlighted with red arrows is we periodically see a run of positive residuals that move through the population over time. And they get washed out after a couple of years. But what this indicates is that there's probably a pulse of strong recruitment a year or two prior to when they start appearing in this fishery. Then that large year class then moves through the population, and we can see it in our size composition data. The other thing is that I've mentioned that the deep set fishery for Hawaiian longline doesn't target swordfish, but catches small swordfish. And so what you're looking at here on the right is the overall size mean length in 5x5 degree squares for the deep set fishery on top and the shallow set fishery at the bottom. And so you can see there's some differences between where the fishery is targeting, but the biggest difference is the size of the fish. And so the yellows here, these are all above 140 to 160 as the mean length of swordfish. And the shallow set is targeting swordfish, so this is what they're going after. The deep set, however, are catching most fish under 100 centimeters. And if you remember back to the life history figures that I showed you, swordfish reach 100 centimeters at about 1 year. And so what this tells us is that the deep set fishery is catching primarily young of the year fish. And we can see this influx of fish in our length, if we look at our length composition data for this fishery by month. And so on the left is the monthly for all of the Hawaii longline data with a mean length highlighted here. This is the line for mean length. And then May, June, July, this is when we believe that swordfish are spawning around Hawaii. And so you can see the average size is around 140 to 150 centimeters. But in August, September, and October, we see these peaks of very small fish. The size, the mean length decreases pretty substantially down to about 100 centimeters. And you can actually see the this peak move and grow into the population over time. And if we just look at the deep set data alone, this change is even more clear. That most of the year, the deep set fishery doesn't catch very many fish in general, but also they're all pretty much all sizes. But in August here, we start seeing this influx of small fish, then peaks in September and October, and then declines again as they grow into November and December. And so what this tells us is that we can see a very strong recruitment pulse. These are all, 50 to 60 centimeter fish. They're a couple of months old. And so we're seeing recruitment to the fishery of young of the year fish. And so we have a really good idea of how many, when the relative size of the incoming class of recruitment. And so we have some really good information on recruitment. So we've looked at 4 different environmental variables to try to better understand what is driving swordfish recruitment. And these are the Southern Oscillation Index, and it's the average of the April through July indices, monthly values from 1975 to 2016. then the mean phytoplankton cell size and biomass, and I'll get into more details in this in a minute, but this is work that Phoebe Woodworth-Jeffcoats has been doing, and it's really interesting. And basically, we bounded an area around Hawaii, which is here at this red box is approximately the area. And Phoebe has provided us with estimates of the mean phytoplankton cell size in I can't remember what months. May through July, I believe, from sea surface temperature and chlorophyll data. And what this does is gives us an idea of what size food may be available for larval swordfish. So swordfish grow very quickly. By the time they're 10 centimeters long, they have a fully developed bill and are voracious predators. And so their survival, we believe, will be pretty directly related to how much phytoplankton and the size of the phytoplankton that are available for them to eat in their larval period. And Phoebe has found for our big-eye tuna fishery that if they lag this index by 4 years, it provides a very good prediction of how strong our CPUE indice will be for big-eye tuna. And so we believe to see a similar pattern for swordfish. And then the other two environmental indices we are interested in is the Pacific Decadal Oscillation Index and the Oceanic Nino Index, which is the index for the ENSO region 3.4, which is the area right around the Galapagos Islands. So those are the four environmental indices that we explored. There's so many more available. These ones we felt influence the North Pacific in the most predictable ways, and also have been shown to be important in other ways to swordfish in the North Pacific, for example, with CPUE and things like that. So what I provided you here is a plot of the annual recruitment of thousands of H0 recruits from the base case model. So this is no environmental indices in it over time. And we took this information and calculated what the recruitment variability would be explained by each of the 3 different climatological indices. So the ONI is the Oceanic Nino Index, PDO is the Pacific Decadal Oscillation Index, and then SOI is the Southern Oscillation Index, and compared that to the variability explained without the index. And so the more variability, the larger this value is, the more variability is explained, and the better that environmental index is for providing information for our recruitment. And so what you can see for these 3 indices, which we could compare because they're all over the same time scale, the Southern Oscillation Index is the best explainer for recruitment variability for swordfish. And this is a pattern that we have seen multiple times over the past 10 years. John Bronziak has shown it several times that swordfish recruitment is strongly correlated to the Southern Oscillation Index. It's a fairly consistent pattern. Each time we rerun the assessment, we find the same pattern. So it's promising that at least, for the last decade, this has been a persistent pattern. And so we expect that it would be reasonable to expect that it would continue into the future. And so we did a simple correlation between the Southern Oscillation Index and our recruitment, and it's got an R-squared of about 0.1. And we also looked at the correlation between the recruitment and the plankton biomass. And we could not compare this one in the same way that we do for the environmental indices because they're on a different time scale, but we have an R-squared of 0.05. And so this is one that we're particularly interested in because we know that it is a good indicator for big-eye tuna, and so we wanted to continue to explore this for swordfish as well. To look at some of the model results, these are a comparison of the two models, the base case model, which is black, and the model with the Southern Oscillation Index included as an index of recruitment. And what you can see is, for the most part, this is our spawning biomass over time on the left and the H0 recruitment on the right. For the most part, including the Southern Oscillation Index as an environmental index, it's a recruitment index, doesn't change the model very much. It certainly doesn't change the general pattern. We have a little bit different mean biomass, especially in the early time period of the model. And this is more evident if we look at our recruitment information. And so you can see here in the early time series, really before we have length composition data, which remember begins in about 1994, the Southern Oscillation Index is much more of an effect on our annual recruitment than at the end of the time series, when we have a lot more information on recruitment. So one of the things it does is it makes our recruitment, our interannual recruitment, variability much larger. So we have higher recruits some year and lower recruits other years compared to the base case, but it also does increase the uncertainty around that recruitment a little bit. It's a little bit difficult to tell from this figure, but it's annual recruitment, the variability around each individual recruitment estimate is smaller. And I just want to give you an idea of what the annual Southern Oscillation Index looks like. So this is from 1975 to 2021 actually, but I just wanted to highlight that this period of really of more variability in our recruitment due to the Southern Oscillation Index also consists with a period of pretty strong changes in the Southern Oscillation Index during this time. And so part of the reason that we're not seeing big changes later in our time series, maybe because later in the time series of the Southern Oscillation Index, we also don't have as big changes. If we look at the incorporation of the phytoplankton index into our model, again, this is our spawning biomass on the left, with black being the base case model and the blue being the model with phytoplankton as an index of recruitment. And on the right is our recruitment, our annual recruitment in millions of fish. You can see that the this index only begins in 2002, and so the time at which we would have any impact on our model is at the very end. And so the estimated biomass is slightly higher if we include the phytoplankton index at the end of the time series. And you can see the recruitment is generally a little bit higher as well. And so, you know, this index is a lot flatter, and it does explain less of the variability in the recruitment, but we still have some questions to explore for this index specifically. So overall, the conclusions of, you know, incorporating these environmental data into the stock assessment that we have is, you know, including the Southern Oscillation does change the recruitment estimates prior to our, you know, our so-called data-rich period. This is the period 1975 to 1994, before we have, you know, good length composition data to give information for year class size. It does increase the magnitude of the recruitment deviations, but it doesn't have an impact on the overall stock status or the population size. Including our phytoplankton index has even less of an impact. Part of this is because it's a much shorter time series. Our recruitment and spawning stock biomass is slightly higher in the last few years. It also doesn't change stock status or population size, you know, but there's still questions to explore here, is including a different time of year or a different, you know, increase the footprint of this index, or incorporating a lagged period to improve our fit, similar to what we've seen with the big-eyed tuna. So we have some more exploration to go down this route. It's promising. We are lucky that we have the kind of data that we can explore these types of things. And so, it's something that we will continue to work on as we move forward. But the last thing that I wanted to talk about today is looking at how to incorporate these environmental data into our future projections. It's all fine and good to say that the Southern Oscillation Index is influencing swordfish recruitment, but what our managers really want to know is how is it going to influence the recruitment into the future? And this is much harder, partly because we have much less idea of what's going to happen in the future. These indices are calculated from observed conditions, and so what we have to do is link a climatological model that's predicting the future climate with our fisheries models. So we have some advantages on our side. Stock assessments, to begin with, are generally a year or two behind the present. So the stock assessment, the 2018 swordfish stock assessment, ended in 2016. And so by the time that we were assessing the assessment, we had another year or a year and a half of environmental observations that we can use to predict, to project our populations. But we are often requested for 5 to 10 years of projections. We're asked for these projections, but management decisions aren't always made on this time period, and it doesn't mean that we can't update projections on a shorter time period. So for the highly migratory species in the North Pacific, we are generally on a 4 to 5 year schedule for assessments, but it is always possible to provide projection information on a more regular basis if we're trying to include observed environmental conditions. But in order to reach these needs, we really need a projection framework which can include environmental covariates and also estimates of those environmental covariates into the future. And so those are the two key things that we're trying to tackle with this component of this work. So the model to incorporate environmental projections is actually the easy part. So for the Western and Central North Pacific swordfish, we use a 2-gender implementation of the SSFutures software that was developed by Bamoko Ichinokawa out of Japan, and has been modified by Hirotaka for the Western and Central North Pacific Ocean swordfish. And he took it a step further to be able to incorporate an environmental covariate into our Beverton-Holt equation for estimating future recruitment. So this model incorporates uncertainty in the initial stock numbers at age by gender using parametric bootstrapping of the base case model. And then we randomly sample from the fitted stock recruitment model as estimated in the base case model. So to estimate the environmentally impacted recruitment, we have a modified Beverton-Holt equation with an environmental coefficient. And so Hirotaka was able to develop this model for us, and it works very well. And so, this is the easy part of incorporating environmental covariates into our future projections. Then we looked at how to predict environmental data into the future. And so this is where, we really leaned heavily on folks not only outside our stock assessment world, but also outside of the National Marine Fisheries Service world, and reached across NOAA line offices for additional help. And so Phoebe Woodworth-Jeffcoats has been instrumental in helping us get these kinds of data. So we looked at the predicted values of the Southern Oscillation Index. So from 2017 to 2019, we have that information. And it turns out that the Southern Oscillation Index can be projected about 2 years or 8 quarters into the future from the ENSO Clipper model And this is from the national, it's got a lot of letters in it. Anyways, so we have the information for 2020 and 2021. Since we're several years removed from the 2018 assessment, we actually have 5 years of this index for projections. And so here is the figure of the Southern Oscillation Index over time, starting in 1975. So the black line is the data that went into the base case model, and the red is the estimated or predicted Southern Oscillation that went into our projections model. So far we have run the model using 2 different constant F scenarios. So we have, assuming we can fish at the fishing mortality at MSY, which is about 0.17, and then the other option is to continue with our status quo. So we continue to fish at our current fishing mortality, which is 0.08. And so what you're looking at is the fishing mortality at MSY projection on top. Black is the spawning stock biomass in Q3 from our stock synthesis base case model. This dotted line is the MSY value in Q2, so right before spawning would occur. And then the red and blue here indicate the 2 different projections. So the blue indicates no environmental covariate in our projections. Red indicates the projected Southern Oscillation Index in our projections. And so the main things that you should, consider when we're looking at these figures is, one, that there's almost no difference between the 2 projections for our spawning stock biomass. But also, I wanted to point out that the uncertainty associated with the 2 projections is actually decreased when we incorporate the environmental index. And this is because the sigma R associated with the environmentally modified recruitment is actually estimated to be smaller than that from the one coming out of the stock assessment model. And so the uncertainty for our future projected spawning stock biomass is also smaller. So I was a little bit concerned to see that there was almost no difference incorporating the environmental covariate with the future projections compared to not incorporating it. And so we looked closer at the annual recruitment estimate. So this is in thousands of age 0 fish. Again, this dark black line is the values out of the stock assessment model, base case model. And then the blue line indicates the projected recruitment with no environment. The red line indicates the projected recruitment with the Southern Oscillation Index. And what you can see is that with the Southern Oscillation Index, the recruitment is more variable, but it's not very different. And this may be because, again, looking at our Southern Oscillation Index, these 5 years of predicted value are actually fairly similar. So the Southern Oscillation Index historically has varied between +1 and -1, but these 5 years in our projections have been between -0.3 and 0.5, and so there's just not a lot of variability. And so I wanted to know, if there is a lot of variability in our Southern Oscillation Index, does our projections show that same change? So I created some predicted Southern Oscillation Index where it varies between basically -0.2 and +0.2, just to see if I pushed this environmental index to its maximum extremes, will we see a similar change reflected in our projections? And so at the top here is our annual recruitment again, and this red is the estimated recruitment with the Southern Oscillation Index if we're seeing some extreme values. And so the answer is yes. So our recruitment model or our projection software is working. Our environmental index just isn't that influential on our recruitment, and then also our spawning stock biomass. There's just so many other things going on that we're not seeing, that change. So I'm just want to give a few final conclusions before we switch to questions. The Western Central North Pacific swordfish size composition data indicates that we have strong recruitment pulses. They could be related to environmental forces, possibly the Southern Oscillation Index, possibly the mean phytoplankton size. But our data does have a lot of information about recruitment in it already, and so including these environmental indices, may not substantially change the population trajectory. But in the future, if we see some consistent, changes in the environment around us, it may be something that we want to consider as we move forward. The expectation is that the waters around Hawaii will continue to warm. The Southern Oscillation Index, when it is in a positive, I believe it's positive, we have generally warmer than average temperatures, and so it's possible that persistently positive Southern Oscillation Index could have an impact on our assessment, and that's something that we should be considering. The effects that we're seeing now, there's still a lot of questions that we have. Is it because there are small changes in the Southern Oscillation Index? Is it a delayed effect? We know that swordfish have a pretty large sleepiness, and so swordfish populations can double in anywhere from 2 to 4 years. So it's possible that we just can't project far enough in advance to really capture an effect of the environmental index on it. So I often like to leave with some nice tidy conclusions, and we don't have them yet for this work, but I think that we have a lot of really interesting questions to continue to address. So some of our future work is really promising. We're going to continue to work on the phytoplankton cell size, looking at legs and how well we can project it. With Hirotaka and I have some plans to incorporate a lot more simulation work for the North Pacific highly migratory species in general. Hira has been working to look at a complex, well, not a complex, but several different highly migratory species of tuna and billfish. And so we want to be able to simulate a similar population model assessment, and then assuming environment is influencing recruitment or not influencing recruitment, and see how that might affect our future projections. And so while our modeling framework definitely exists, the data that we need to incorporate environment into our future projections may not exist yet. But the folks at the Geophysical Fluid Dynamics Lab have been doing some really, really cool work looking at short-term projections in environment. So this is a paper from Desiree that in 2017, where they were projecting, forecasting different climatological and covariates into the future for 1 to 10 years in advance, and especially around Hawaii, they're having some really good success looking at hindcasting, being able to predict things like increases in temperature and things into the future. And so I'm really excited about what's coming out of our climatological models, and I'm really excited to look at how as fishery scientists, we can start incorporating their information into our models and work closer together with some of the folks in our other line offices. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to my boss and take any questions.
Thank you so much, Michelle. Okay, this is Katie, and I will be reading through the questions we have so far. So coming in earlier, while the talk was still going, Terrence Wang is asking, have the effects of SOI and or phytoplankton on median fork length been explored?
On median fork length? No, that's really interesting. One of the things that we've been looking at with SOI is I've been working to do some spatial temporal modeling of the swordfish around the Hawaiian Islands, and we see that the distribution of swordfish changes depending on the Southern Oscillation Index, whether it's further to the north and east or further to the south and west. But the size of the swordfish, we haven't looked at that yet. That would be interesting.
Great, thank you. Next question comes from Michael Secchi. Have you looked at or plan to look at environmental considerations with respect to the catch time series? As the various fisheries target different fishing regions, depths, and time of year, I imagine that would be a bit involved.
So we do consider several environmental covariates in our standardization of our CPUE indices. One of the challenges of looking at environmental covariates with our catch indices is that it can be really hard to determine if the environment is influencing the fisher behavior or the fish behavior. And so, for example, in Hawaii, our swordfish fishermen really target swordfish around the North Pacific subtropical convergence zone. That's our frontal zone that have a lot of swordfish, and the fishermen go there to catch fish, and they know what temperature to target. And so the question is, are they targeting swordfish because the swordfish are in that, do we know that they're targeting warm water because that's where the swordfish are, or do we think that's where the swordfish are because that's where the fishermen are? We can get at that to some extent with looking at non-targeting fisheries, so that the Hawaiian deep set aren't targeting swordfish, and so it's a little bit more random, if you will. Some of that information could come from our satellite tagging, but for our CPUE indices, we look at sea surface temperature, we look at mixed layer depth, we look at all of the climatological indices. We also look at some things like the lunar illumination, because swordfish are caught at night, and their location in the water column depends on how bright the moon is that night. So the answer is yes, we do, and the U.S. does more than other areas, more than some of the other countries, but it's all something that we do consider, yeah.
Great, thank you. Our next question comes from Yang Li. The survey shows the recruitment signals show up in September to December. Why the environmental variables are averaged over April, July?
That's a good question. So our recruitment signals are, they're about 50 centimeters is when we first start seeing large numbers of fish in our area. And at that point, the fish are no longer strongly influenced by the environment. And so what we're trying to get at is basically their larval stages. So when fish are reproducing, when they're eggs in the water, when they're larvae in the water, we think that they are going to be more at the mercy of the environmental conditions to influence their survival. And so that is the time period that we are interested in estimating. So especially for the phytoplankton, the index, because that is what they're going to be eating. And once they grow to 50 centimeters, they're not eating phytoplankton anymore, they're eating fish. So their interactions with the environment are going to be very different.
Okay, thank you. Next question comes from Kelly Andrews. Do you know how the SIO is projected? The main question here being, will this projection ever project extreme SIO values?
I don't know how it's projected. I don't have all of the information on that. I'm not an oceanographer. Phoebe Woodworth-Jeffcoats would have a lot more information on that than I do. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Great.
Next question is from Hassan Mustafan. Can you please show the SR equation with an environmental covar? You mentioned it's a modified BH. It will be interesting to see what was modified from BH.
I don't have a slide with that on it. so I can't show that. I'm sorry.
No, okay, thank you. Next question is from Robert Wildermuth. Have you looked at leave one out or other cross-validation methods for looking at performance of the SOI index's ability to guide stock projections?
Not yet, but that's a really good, that's a good suggestion. It's something I'll have to do.
Thank you. Next is from Laura Lee. Her first question is, why did you choose a quarterly time step?
That is how the data is available from the regional fisheries management organizations. It's a little bit of a compromise between time and fine scale information. It's also a little bit to do with the way that some of our CPUE indices are standardized, and that that some of the Japanese longline indices are broken down by area and quarter as their fishery changes over the year, and so they standardize their data by area and quarter, and so we use a quarterly time step.
Great, thank you. Next question is from Kelly Johnson. She's wondering where we can find the executable or more information on the SSFutures package.
That is a good question. You can contact Hirotaka Ijima-san, or I'm sorry, Hirotaka Ijima. He is the one that wrote, uses the model. It's through the ISE. I can certainly provide you his information. I don't know if it's public yet.
Great, thank you. Next is from Aaron Boyeboy. Did you estimate steepness in the base model?
We didn't estimate steepness. Steepness is estimated outside of the model from an individual base model by John Brodziak. So we actually have a pretty good estimate of steepness. And then we also run sensitivity analyses on steepness. So we run, for this model, we ran 0.7, 0.81, 0.9, and then 0.99. And because of the fact that the swordfish stock is on the flat part of the stock recruitment curve, changing the steepness doesn't change the model at all. So it's not sensitive to steepness.
Great, thank you. I'm going to grab a few more questions as we run out of time here. Next one is from Ryan. How do you judge whether the inclusion of the environmental parameter into the assessment results in an improvement in the assessment model or not? For example, you showed us how the estimate of spawning biomass changed slightly, but is it possible to judge whether there is an improvement?
That's a really good question. I'm going to say probably not. A lot of the decisions between whether or not to include something is subjective, and some of it is, based on what you've seen in other areas. I would be more concerned if it changed the stock, the projection, not the projection, I'm sorry, the trajectory of the population substantially. A lot of it is looking at diagnostics and seeing how the inner workings of the model changes. We have pretty good data for swordfish. So if something like the Southern Oscillation Index is going to really change our model, we would start questioning whether or not this is a good change or a bad change, and does it fit within our understanding of the population biology of the fish in general. We have not put this forward for management advice yet. It's definitely still a research undertaking that we're really trying to better understand. How do you decide what to keep in a model and what not to?
Great, thank you. And one last question before the 4 o'clock hour from Mackenzie. Did the SOI index or phytoplankton index remove the residual patterns that were seen in the base case?
I don't know. I haven't looked at that yet. That's a good thing that I should look at. Thank you. Good idea.
Okay, thank you everyone for the really great questions. We did not get to all of them, so I will pass these on to Michelle afterwards and she can answer you offline. But thank you so much, Michelle and Kristen, for our introduction. And just a reminder, this has been recorded, so it will be posted on the library's YouTube channel. And if you have questions, I believe, Michelle, can they reach out to you? Do you have an email that you can?
Yep, it's michelle.sculley@noaa.gov. So feel free to get in touch.
Wonderful. And thank you, everyone. I hope you have a wonderful day, evening, and stay safe.
Thanks.